Whakamau o ka nohi ki runga i a rangi toto. Tahuri ake koe te moana ki wai te mata. Ka ito waka ki o rā kei iri ora o rā kei matataniwha. Takahia e koe te one ki o kahu. Rere tiko tō haere ki te tai o te uru ko maunga kia tuno ana. Tūkea monga whau te taha whakararo. Ka heke ka piki ki runga no i te matua tēnā whenua. Ko waipapa te marae. Ko waipapa te tauranga waka. Ko waipapa taumatarau. Ka piki anō ki te reo ngā whenua ara te pai maunga o rangi puke. E whātare mai nei ki a mātou. Ko ngā wai o horutu te marae. Ko ngā wai o horutu te awa. E rere nei, e tere tonu nei. Nei rā mātou, e noho nei, i raro i te tuanui, o tēnei o ngā whare ara ko te pūrengi. E whātolotoro ana, ngā ringa mana hau, mata kui pōwhiri ki tēnā o koutou, e kia nei te kōrero nau mai, haere mai, whakatau mai rā. Haere mai rā ki runga no i tēnei whenua, o tira me te mana whenua o Ngāti Whātua rākei. Haere mai rā ki runga no i tēnei whare wānanga, arā, ko te wānanga aronui o tāmai ki makaurau, AUT, e mihi nei, e tangi nei ki a koutou katoa. Nō reira aha kua kowai, aha kua nohia, e tātou mā, piki mai, kake mai, nau mai, haere mai, tēnā koutou, nei rā mātou ka mihi, tēnā koutou katoa.
Kia ora. I'm Jaden from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Kia ora is a Māori word for saying hello, down here in the economy that is lucky enough to be hosting APEC 2021. Just not actually down here. Like you, we were ready to welcome everyone to our homes, to give representatives of all 21 APEC economies a taste of who we are. But also like you, we are determined to support the global COVID response. And that's why you're viewing us like this, virtually. So, now it's time for us to introduce ourselves. Are you ready? Let's go. Welcome to your virtual introduction to Aotearoa, New Zealand. We are a place of open spaces with fertile, productive land. Oh, yum. Monique, save some for me. This land gives us the space to dream and think clearly and differently. Isn't that right, Peter?
For us, it's not so much technologies that have been developed in New Zealand, but more so the very, very clever and educated people with the New Zealand attitude of happy to kind of push the boundaries.
Far out! We are people of open hearts, where you will be welcomed as part of a community that believes in bringing people together. This is how we will all join together. We are people of open minds, where different views are shared and supported, and hard work and teamwork is encouraged. Go, 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 go! Go the All Blacks! Woohoo! This is how we will all work together. All the while embracing and leading technology that helps push the world forward positively, and without limits. Boats that fly, what's next? Whoa! This is how we will all grow together. Join, work, grow, together. Pretty important words, aren't they, Prime Minister?
They really are, Jaden. As we plan for recovery from COVID-19, it is economic cooperation through APEC, the most dynamic region in the world's economy, that will help us all rebuild. Like never before, the scale of the challenges the world faces today requires us all to work together for the greater good. We will create an environment where connections can be made and APEC's important work can continue, including progress on sustainability, ensuring widespread adoption of digital tools to drive productivity, and developing inclusive plans that create opportunities for all our people. The way we respond as a region to today's challenges will be felt for generations to come. APEC 2021 New Zealand will be the start of reigniting growth, continuing trade, and setting a plan for long-lasting recovery across the entire region. To all the 2021 APEC delegates, we look forward to providing a warm welcome to Aotearoa, New Zealand, virtually. as we join, work, grow together.
Haumi e, hui e, tai ki e.
Ina mana, ina reo, I reo rangatira mā. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora everyone and welcome to APEC Voices of the Future 2021. My name is Tim McCready and as a former Voices of the Future delegate all those years ago, it is a real pleasure to be your MC again today. I enjoyed meeting with you all at our introductory meeting a few weeks ago, and I know that since then you have had drafting sessions and discussions to prepare the Youth Declaration that will be handed to the New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern tomorrow. I hope that by now you know each other well and are looking forward to the Voices event today and tomorrow. You will have already experienced New Zealand's warm welcome, or manaakitanga in the Māori language, and we aim to extend that through to the end of the meeting and then beyond into the CEO Summit later in the week. Before we begin, can I ask all delegates participating on Zoom to make sure you're watching this on speaker view rather than gallery view? That will make your participation much more enjoyable. And also, please keep your microphone on mute unless it is your turn to speak. Now, when we get to questions, I will give the first opportunity to those delegations who have indicated interest in asking a question or who are part of the drafting group for one of our 4 themes. For this, you can refer to the list that was distributed last week. Let me take this opportunity to welcome 2 delegations who were not able to be present for our introductory meeting. Kia ora to Mexico and Korea. I would also like to acknowledge the contribution made to the event already by the speakers at our drafting sessions. Connie Siu from Hong Kong, Valerie Kong from the United States, Raed Ali from Fiji, and Bianca Goebel and Taylor Hawkins from Australia, as well as Masa Mohageg, Nikita Kent, Siobhan O'Connor, and Shay Wright, all based right here in New Zealand. I would also like to recognise the work of the drafting groups, which have met under the coordination of our 5 Voices alumni, Zach, Courtney, Kiriana, Tracy, and Hannah. We will hear more about the work of these groups as we move through the agenda. For today, our focus is firmly on APEC, the grouping that gives APEC Voices its name. We start with keynote remarks from Dr. Rebecca Fatima Santamaria, the Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat, and 2 of her staff, who will speak to us about APEC's role in the region. But what is APEC? Let's start off with a quick introduction.
If you follow the news, chances are you've heard of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, more commonly known as APEC. You would have also seen footage and photos of world leaders gathering during the yearly APEC Economic Leaders meetings. For a lot of people, that's the extent of what they know about APEC. Of course, it is much more than that. APEC is a multilateral organization made up of 21 members that line the Pacific Ocean who are working towards a common goal of bringing growth and prosperity to the Asia-Pacific region. APEC's members participate in the forum as economies. This emphasizes the forum's focus on matters of trade and economic cooperation. Under these conditions, members who have different approaches to policy can find a common approach to finding solutions and getting things done. APEC is culturally diverse. It includes both developing and advanced economies. Collectively, the APEC region is home to almost 3 billion people, accounting for half of world trade and more than half of the global economy. It is important that we understand that APEC isn't just the annual leaders meeting. In fact, it is a continuous process involving around 20,000 representatives from all levels of government, with representatives from business and the academia, attending hundreds of meetings held all year long. They meet to ensure that goods, services, investment, and people move easily across borders. Members align regulations, set standards, and agree upon policies that make it easier to be an entrepreneur in the region. Officials learn from each other about dozens of topics, ranging from economic growth, increasing the participation of women in the economy, energy, public health, e-commerce, to the environment, and the list goes on. Diverse as APEC is, getting everyone to be on the same page requires a lot of work. Which brings us to one of APEC's defining characteristics. By intent and tradition, APEC is less formal than other forums, and its outcomes may be adopted by members voluntarily. This may seem unusual, but it makes APEC an important platform for cooperation. Even as members deal with delicate issues outside the forum, they will continue to engage each other in APEC. The forum is consensus-driven, and each member has an equal say in decision-making. Because members can cooperate without the pressure of binding agreements, there is less inhibition around new initiatives. This has made APEC a test kitchen of sorts, which has developed more than a few successful ideas that have been adopted by other organizations. APEC's structure has allowed it to grow organically and adapt easily to the times. Although it may not be obvious, we feel its effects. APEC is changing the way the world works and is making life better for people in the Asia-Pacific region. To learn more about us, visit www.apec.org or engage us on social media.
Now, let me introduce our first speaker. Dr. Rebecca Fatima Santamaria has been Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat, based in Singapore since 2019. Before that, she was a senior official in the Malaysian Ministry of Trade. In the interest of time, please refer to the handout we sent you for Dr. Rebecca's more comprehensive biographic details, as well as those of other speakers. Dr. Rebecca will be accompanied today by two of her staff, Yasmin Mohammed Amin and Benjamin Tan. Together, they will provide an introduction to APEC's work and the important role that it plays in the Asia-Pacific region. Dr. Rebecca, could I ask you please to start with some opening remarks?
Thank you so much. APEC Voices, delegates from member economies, friends, ladies and gentlemen, greetings from the APEC Secretariat and good day. Let me start with a quote from Malala Yousafzai. She says, "When the world is silent, even one voice becomes powerful." So for me, therein is your raison d'etre. This is your time. I am pleased to see you continuing to bring APEC's youth together to discuss four very relevant themes. And, namely international cooperation to combat COVID-19, the digital future, a greener future, and a future for all. Yes, for sure, you will make a difference as you provide us your perspective on these themes. I am sure you will make it very real for all of us that your call to action matters, that our discussions must go beyond rhetoric. The APEC Putrajaya Vision 2040 spells out our aspiration for the region. The trade and investment economic driver will, of course, continue to be our bread and butter. But we have included innovation and digitalization and strong, balanced, secure, sustainable, and inclusive growth as our other two equally important drivers. And these two drivers are what will make APEC stand out, and where your contribution, your voice matters. For our work streams on inclusive growth to be meaningful, we must include our youth in the conversations. It is really heartening to note that under New Zealand's leadership, the Voices of the Future Youth Summit will again be a key part of APEC Economic Leaders Week, along with the Ministerials and the CEO Summit. Yes, it is important for all of us to have a deeper appreciation of your position on matters that impact APEC community at large, whether it is the concerns of the gig workers, the gamers, the startups, your stand on the future of skills, education, climate change, and sustainable development. Last year when I spoke to you, I asked, so whether the role of APEC youth in this journey? Today I ask the same question. I know that young leaders from the APEC Voices continue to serve the community with passion, using their diverse skills and talents. Cliched as it may sound, you are the future of APEC. So we must do more to engage each other beyond just these once-a-year events. I know that you would like to have deeper engagement with policymakers. You reflected this in your 2017 Youth Declaration, when you appealed to APEC leaders to provide youth from the Asia-Pacific region with the opportunities and platforms to engage them and policymakers in voicing their concerns on issues relating to education and employment. You asked that APEC considers an entrepreneurship program such as the Entrepreneurs Week to provide youth with training, simulations, and financing in order to scale their innovations. In your 2018 declaration, you stressed the need to further improve the education system in the economies by developing an inclusive digital world in which schools teach digital literacy, internet ethics, and responsible internet usage. As I shared with you last year, we do have initiatives that involve the youth. For example, the APEC Gig Economy Challenge, which is a contest seeking solutions to improve the financial health of the workers. The APEC App Challenge, wherein we encourage software developers and designers to create applications that can help small businesses. And the APEC Prize for Innovation, Research and Education, or ASPIRE, which recognizes the work of young researchers who pursue sustainable economic growth. It has been one of my hopes that our engagement with the youth go beyond competitions. So for me, the competitions are just the seed for us to grow. So I'm pleased that in collaboration with the Asia Foundation and Google, we will be looking to build on the App Challenge, starting with the participants of this initiative. We hope to provide you more details in due course. On entrepreneurship, we have, for example, the APEC Entrepreneurship Education Program. This is focused on building capacity and collaborative connectivity for women and young entrepreneurs. In July, we had the second APEC Forum on Digital Innovation and Entrepreneurship, which focused on building capacity and collaborative connectivity for young entrepreneurs. This forum was developed to build capacity for emergent entrepreneurship through the transfer and development of knowledge, skills, and technical know-how between the experienced entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs-to-be from various economies in the Asia Pacific. So yes, we have responded to some of your requests. However, even as you highlight your requests and needs, it is equally important that you also share with us how you can contribute and work with us to realize these objectives. Follow through and calling out where we have fallen short is just as necessary. Let me share with you that APEC has been successful in mainstreaming the women's economic agenda in our work. So we can surely do the same for youth. So here's the challenge for you. Tell us how we can build on the initiatives that we have in place. Tell us how you see your role in the implementation of the APEC Putrajaya Vision 2040. So on behalf of the APEC Secretariat, I'd like to thank the APEC Voices, Leadership Council, and the New Zealand team for organizing this youth summit and carrying on the important task of presenting your declaration to the leaders. I would like to thank Yasmin and Ben for the time that they will take to share with you some of their perspectives as young officers at the APEC Secretariat. I also want to thank the panelists and speakers for helping to inspire and motivate our young people in the Asia Pacific through this summit. For the APEC Voices delegates, may I take this opportunity to wish you a fruitful deliberation the next 2 days. I look forward to solid outcomes and ideas that would help us on our journey to a better tomorrow for all of us in APEC. Thank you so much for your attention and all the very best.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rebecca. It's great to hear a little bit more about those initiatives. We do have some questions for you from our delegates, so I will ask Australia to ask their question first.
Hi there. So how do you best see youth represented in the world following today's Youth Summit? And how can youth continue to engage further to have a positive impact within their local economy and abroad?
I think what we're doing now at the summit is really good. You have, provided us some feedback. You've got your declaration. What we need to do now is to just take that further and have a better appreciation of the various programs that we have, and then see how we can engage you and participate in those events. We have, like I said, the App Challenge, and from there we will be starting to grow and have an alumni of folks who participated, and to see how we can continue to learn from each other and also to track their progress after their participation in the App Challenge. So what has happened? I always ask that question. So what? You've done this, so what? Where do you go next after this competition? So it's important for us to be able to track what the youth have been doing after those initiatives. Also, there are areas, the fora, and Benjamin and Yasmin will share with you, there are opportunities for for the youth to participate in some of our capacity building programs, and to share, best practices and learn from the folks who participate in these programs. So it's an open invitation to the youth. We will have it out on our website. Ben will be able to explain better on the trade and investment programs and projects that we have and how you can participate in them.
Thank you, Australia. And Dr. Rebecca Brunei, I believe that you have a question next.
Hello. So I just have one question. So far, you've been talking about how APEC has also needed the help of the youth for social change and things like that. But I am wondering, how do you keep track with youth initiatives that use APEC statements? Because I would just like to see if there has been any projects the youth have done under APEC itself. Thank you.
Yeah, like I said, I mean, the tracking, we do track all the various initiatives that come out of APEC. We monitor, we have a project tracker even just to see where the projects are. For the youth, I suppose it's about participation in these events and then also providing the necessary feedback when you do attend this. I also, like I said, track and have a look at the declarations, the many declarations that you've put out. And it's just as important for the youth to track those declarations, those things that you put in the declaration, and then come back and call us out if you think we haven't done it. I think it works both ways. While we look at tracking, and we do track at the Secretariat, we track the ministerial statements, the leaders' statements, and the work that we need to do. Our to-do list is pretty long. But in your case, I think it's just as important that you also track your various declarations and come back to us and say, hey, you have not done this, and this, how can we do this better? It's always good to have this bottom-up approach rather than to wait for us to track it and tell you, oops, here's something you talked about, like, in 2017. So what's happening? So it does work both ways. And I look forward to hearing from you. I mean, we have my email address is out there on our website. Please do drop me a line, to say, as a group, the Voices feel very strongly that we haven't had this opportunity to talk to folks from the Secretariat. I'm sorry that I only speak to you once a year, So there are things that, and I've encouraged, like I said, we work very closely with the Asia Foundation, and I've asked that the Asia Foundation start talking more, more intensely with, engaging more with the Voices, and you have your representative office here in Singapore, and I've encouraged that they do more and they talk to each other more to see how we can, those initiatives that we already have in place, like the work that we're doing with the Asia Foundation, how can we take that further? How can we engage you more? How can we have your voices heard more in the work that we're doing? Okay?
That's some great advice there, and I know that our delegates are very vocal, so you may find some emails there in your inbox. We have another question for you from Chile.
Hi, Mrs. Rebecca. My name is Javier Sepulveda from Chile. My question is, why is the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation important in the current international context, particularly in topics about climate change, digital future and development? And what is the future and challenges of international cooperation between APEC members important, especially for the youth?
Yep. Thank you for that question. I mean, this is not just a question that you ask. This is a question that's regularly asked of us. Why bother? But really, what has happened over the last 2 years with COVID, we found that you cannot go. No one economy can go it alone. You can have domestic initiatives, but at the end of the day, this is a global pandemic. So we need each other. We need to help each other. When vaccines have to move from point A to point B, it doesn't just involve one economy or two economies. It involves a whole bunch of us. When we're looking at value chains, supply chains, it's not the work of one economy. One economy cannot do it alone. So it is really us working together to find solutions to make to facilitate the movement of these vaccines, for example. So when talking about climate change, climate change cannot be confined to one particular economy. It is all of us together because we all breathe the same air, as it were, you know. So it is collaborative, and that's why the work that's going on at COP26 is just as important. At APEC, we track it. The ministers, as they're meeting, they met last night, they will continue their meeting tonight. They talk about how important it is for us that these initiatives cannot be by one economy. You can't have one economy saying, I'm having zero carbon, you know, emissions, when it affects all of us. So it's precisely these issues which need all of us to band together and find solutions. Let me say that I'm very optimistic. I'm an internationalist, a regionalist. I believe in regional economic cooperation, and really, and you see this happening. It is that peer pressure, as well as the information from the scientific community, our scientific community, sharing all these data with us, that makes the initiatives really take shape and have meaning to the initiatives that we're doing. So no one can go at it alone.
Thank you. I might just put one last question to you, actually. You touched on vaccines there, and I'd like to ask you just about the pandemic. I know that typically APEC brings people together multiple times per year. How have you adjusted to working virtually in this environment?
Well, we had to learn the hard way last year when we went into, various economies went into lockdown, and we didn't anticipate. I mean, just say this is a major black swan event. We didn't anticipate it, but we had to learn and learn fast. And I'm really proud of the team. They learned very fast. We quickly adjusted. I mean, I had to learn how to use Zoom and GoTo and God knows all these different platforms. But it is that mindset that helps us along. It is not saying, and feeling sorry for yourself because all these things you're being overwhelmed by the situation around you, the environment around you, but really saying, hey, this is something like I said, we need to band together. Let's see how we can work together to deal with this situation. There is technology, and I'm getting to be more and more a fan of technology. Technology is what helped us through the pandemic, working from home, adjusting, teaching us how to be flexible and adjust. You cannot be stuck in your ways, and our rules and regulations need to start being adapted. Those were the days when the idea of working from home was so alien, but the pandemic has just told us, sorry, folks, you got to think differently. And the ability to learn on the run, as it were, is what really matters at the end of the day. So, and then we also need to adjust to how, our youth prefer to work, So adjusting this, building in those flexibilities, looking at our regulations, and are they fit for purpose in this environment? Those are the kinds of thinking process that the pandemic has, forced us to do. We would have gone on in our own leisurely way, organically making changes, but the pandemic was the opportunity for us to make those drastic changes, those changes that, whose time had come, perhaps even overdue. So I see the pandemic as and the crisis that we're going through as a major opportunity for us to reflect on how we've been doing things and to see how we can do them better, and learn from each other. Well, clearly, we cannot do this alone. So the youth, the tech folks, the scientists, and the frontliners, all of us, the health people, the economists, all working together in this environment to find solutions and to make our lives better and help us all recover sustainably from this pandemic.
Mm. Thank you very much. I can imagine everyone watching along nodding their heads when you spoke about the need to come up to speed on all those different technologies. I think we can all relate to that. Thank you very much for that. I'd like to now ask a couple of questions of your colleagues, Yasmin and Ben. First of all, to both of you, I'd like to ask, in your experience as young people working with and within the APEC ecosystem, what do you think about how APEC engages with youth of the region? And do you have any ideas of how the forum should nurture this relationship with youth into the future?
Okay, I'll go first. All right. So I believe APEC does a lot of valuable work, and as it progresses towards 2040, as guided by the APEC Putrajaya vision, it is my view that more could and should be done to engage the youth in APEC. The APEC Voices of the Future program has been in existence since 1998, and I think it should continue. However, I think there are some room for improvement. 3 points. Firstly, I would like the APEC youth to demonstrate to the world that they walk the talk. In the words of the Obamas, quote, "Your word is your bond, and you do what you say you're going to do," unquote. I would like to see continued youth development and engagement opportunities in APEC to follow through on the Youth Declaration after the Voices program concludes each year. Secondly, I would like to see the youth actively engaged and providing inputs in APEC. I would like to echo the words of Youth Delegate Lidway Chin from Auckland. He said, quote, "I believe young people should have a voice at the table because decisions are being made for our generation and future generations," unquote. I agree with him. In fact, I would like to see them go further, and that is to elevate youth engagement beyond the annual Voices program with regular involvement throughout the year and have a youth representative at the APEC meetings. Thirdly, and this is my final point, domestically and internationally, we have youth advocacy agencies engaging and empowering youth to lead the causes they are passionate about. I think APEC should continue to strengthen engagement and collaboration with these agencies and dovetail APEC youth programs with theirs to recognize youth achievements and efforts. I have full confidence in the youth of today. They are a very capable generation.
I think we may have just experienced some of that technology there. Yasmin, we've just lost the end of your response there. But Ben, if you can hear me, I might direct the same question to you.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. Or good evening, wherever you may be. So, in terms of practical, how youth can in a sense, practically affect change policy. I hope that all of you are participating, whether be it in your local town halls, are participating in your various groups, institutions. Back when I was with the ministry, we do receive a lot of letters, lobby letters. That's one way. But at APEC, when we do meet, what do we do here? You can actually participate in a lot of our capacity building workshops, seminars, public-private dialogues. These are open to the public. So you just write in, and then we will get approval for your participation, and then you can give your inputs in these dialogues. So I think some of these are very interesting topics that you will be more interested in will be, for example, SMEs, because you might want to see how does APEC help startups and SMEs, food security, oceans and fisheries, digital economy, telecommunications, trade and investment, and services. I'll just give an example. What we are talking about at APEC is we're trying to promote this idea of interoperability of digital platforms. For example, you're all on 21 different economies. Some of you are on WhatsApp, some of you are on Line, Viber, WeChat, but how do you actually talk to each other? In this digital world, what we found in the last 2 years is that it's become digital meetings, and using these kind of digital platforms, we have to find a system that we can actually talk on. And APEC is the place where we talk about platforms and being interoperable. Each might have your own, but we want to be able to talk to each other. So I think these are some of the ways that the youth can be involved. Of course, there's the other social aspect. We have the photo competition, the app challenge. If you're more technologically savvy, and you actually try to create solutions for some of the problems that we have. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Yasmin, I think we've got you back now. I have another question for you. The pandemic has affected education and early careers of young people in particular. From an APEC standpoint, what should economies be doing collectively to help this young workforce and students that have been impacted by the pandemic?
Thank you, Tim. So in APEC, these issues are addressed in the 2021 APEC Economic Policy Report on Structural Reform and the Future of Work. There are currently 7 APEC initiatives addressing 5 future work policy areas that would help address the youth affected by the pandemic. And these 5 policy areas are: 1, developing effective social protection systems; 2, developing better skills forecasting systems; 3, designing efficient labor market regulations; 4, promoting international labor mobility; and 5, promoting tripartism. APEC also has existing initiatives that would help increase inclusive economic participation for youth, facilitate youth access to the labor market, bridge the digital divide, and ensure that the youth have the support they needed, including the support to mitigate the impact of the pandemic. In conclusion, APEC economies should collectively continue to advance these existing APEC initiatives, and I think the APEC youth should actively participate as crucial stakeholders. Economies should also continue domestic efforts at helping the youth. Economies should also implement the policies discussed in APEC to revive and strengthen socio-economic growth post-pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin. And Ben, our final question to you. Climate change and sustainability are obviously areas that young people in particular are very passionate about. What is APEC doing in terms of climate change cooperation and policy?
Thanks. So I think last year, this year, New Zealand's year, the emphasis has been on 2 things. The first is on COVID, the response to COVID, and the second, which is the thing that we are all talking about, is in the news now, is on environment and climate change. So APEC, we have always had sustainability as one of our priorities. So we're talking about, in terms of the hardcore stuff, we are talking about tariffs on environmental goods. In 2012, we decided to lower tariffs on 54 goods, and we are trying to see whether we can expand these 54 goods to other goods, because technology has new products, technology has changed. We're talking about environmental services as well, regulatory issues surrounding all these services and goods, standards for circular economy, for example, green buildings. Talking about the big issue now, fossil fuel subsidies, IUU, fisheries. These are things that APEC has been trying to do some work. We've got roadmaps, we've got action plans on these. And for next year, just a little bit of preview, Thailand is going to focus on bio-circular green economy as one of its big themes. So it's another area of climate change sustainability. Where I think APEC can do a little bit more work on is on investments. This is, I think, where when the corporates start coming in, when governments start having some kind of framework. And what we hear now is ESG, environmental social governance, green financing practices. So these are things that perhaps we can also take a look at. What a kind of regulatory frameworks when we talk about investments and financing. That's all I have. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. And nice to hear a little bit of a preview of Thailand's focus areas next year. Dr. Rebecca, Yasmin and Ben, thank you so much for your time with us today and sharing your insights on APEC and the region. To conclude this session, we're now going to play one of the videos that the Voices delegates have sent us. You'll be seeing more of these at other points in the program as well.
Amid the pandemic, the world not only bears the brunt on the economic front, but also suffers from the stagnation and dealing with climate emergencies, healthcare inaccessibility, digital divides, and social inequality, all of which echoes the 4 themes of this year's APEC: a greener future, international cooperation to combat COVID-19, the digital future, and a future for all. As an active member of the Asia Pacific, Chinese Taipei calls for stronger regional cooperation and has itself never been so ready to contribute.
On climate emergencies, we urge all economies to take on the task of minimizing the carbon footprint. We also hope to see a consensus reached on the transitions of greener energies that are safe and sustainable. On healthcare inaccessibility, call on our governments to weave a more inclusive and resilient social safety net to support our citizens, especially to those who are vulnerable due to the COVID. On digital divides, we expect all economies to pursue a universal digital literacy and to financially support those who cannot afford electronic devices or internet services. On social inequality, we look forward to a society that people are not stratified by their differences in sex, age, nationality, and their social status.
Faced with these challenges, in no way is Chinese Taipei or any other economy able to avoid the price of non-action. It is this of our common interest to deepen our ties in striving for substantial changes and leave a cleaner, better environment for our next generation. Surprisingly, however, the aggravation of these issues by the pandemic has also spurred the youth of Chinese Taipei to initiate changes.
Up till this point, we have seen student startups devoted to democratizing green electricity for local SMEs, reducing energy consumptions through making food deliveries free of disposable utensils, providing online lessons for underprivileged children in rural areas, etc. But the effort should not end here. The leaders of APEC economics should recognize the needs of the future generation and tap into the creativity of the current youth. As voices of our economy, we say,
the time is now.
Thank you very much, Chinese Taipei, for an excellent video. We now come to the first of 4 sessions which cover the 4 themes of Voices of the Future 2021, international cooperation to combat COVID-19. COVID-19 poses the greatest challenge to the region since the Second World War and raises profound questions for governments and people everywhere. Voices delegates have already had opportunity to discuss this issue at the drafting session held last month for the Youth Declaration. We're going to start by asking the 2 lead drafters who worked on this section of the Declaration, Brian Wong from Hong Kong, China, and Norman Sim from Malaysia, to summarise what it says and the recommendation Voices of the Future delegates are making to APEC leaders on this issue. Over to you, Brian and Norman.
To one of those challenging crises of our times, and that is the ongoing pandemic. And in response to the pandemic, however, we must think not just in terms of the present, but also the future, which is why of the 3 points we've drafted, of which I'm going to talk about the first and also parts of the second point, well, the first and foremost priority I want to emphasize here is cultivating resilience against future pandemics and epidemics at large. Recognizing that one of the main limitations and drawbacks in our ongoing response is a lack of preparedness, both in mentality and access to resources and distribution of vital medical equipment in face of the COVID pandemic, the solution that we recommend is that countries should pull together and put together financial capital, human capital, and also intellectual capital in the forms of knowledge and information when it comes to identifying what WHO terms the disease X, if it hasn't already occurred, and secondly, in cultivating resilience in the populations domestically through education, through partnerships between the government and the private sector, as well as NGOs and civil society at large, in order to ensure that as a collective, APEC is ready, but also as a component of a larger global community that we're ready to serve as an engine of sharing information, of sharing resilience at times of future medical crises, whether it be in adapting to working from home, distant learning, or indeed the terrifying effects of remote learning and distant learning. And this ties me on to the second point, where it's imperative that we can ensure equal access to vital medical resources for far too long privileged nations and those endowed with wherewithal have benefited off the exclusion and alienation of those who can't afford to purchase vital and essential instruments in tackling pandemics at large. And this is where I'll hand over to Norman in terms of outlining more concrete solutions on this front. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Brian. Kia ora, selamat pagi, dan salam sejahtera from Malaysia. I'm Norman Sim, representing the Malaysian delegation. And allow me to complement the elements that have been introduced by my colleague Brian earlier on. Summarizing on our declaration in 3 words will be equality, sustainability, and inclusivity. I will say throughout weekly sessions, we have witnessed polarized thoughts of delegates from APEC region on this very contested and sophisticated theme itself. Nevertheless, throughout weekly meetings, these essential keywords put forth managed to be part of our guiding principles for the production of our declaration. Therefore, our main elements that I think some of it has been announced by my colleague Brian early on, then I shall be presenting to you a new point of it, which includes the condemnation of disgusting discriminatory practices to locally produced vaccines, especially originating from low-income economies and middle-income economies. Second, looking into the idea of a post-COVID recovery plan in the Asia-Pacific region. This definitely roots back to the whole notion of cooperation, whereby economies are urged to cohesively and collectively work hand-in-hand to conduct rapid recovery solutions for sustainability of economic, social, and healthcare sector. And last but not least, we also look into the idea of calling for all APEC member economies to be more proactive and progressive towards the action of ever-worsening mental health agenda in the Asia-Pacific region. With that, this sums up our rather equal, sustainable, and inclusive declaration. Terima kasih, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Norman and Brian, for that. We're now going to turn to our first speaker on this issue, Eduardo Pedrosa. Eduardo is the Secretary General of PEC, the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, which was formed in the early 1980s to bring together government, business, and academia in the Asia-Pacific region. PEC is the forerunner of APEC and is an observer in APEC meetings. PEC is at the cutting edge of analysing the region's problems and making recommendations to governments. Again, I refer you to the biographic notes for more details on Eduardo's impressive background. But Eduardo, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Tim, for the very kind introduction, and thank you to the organisers, APEC Voices 2021, Auckland University of Technology, and of course APEC New Zealand. It's great to be back with Voices, and I wanted to underscore from the outset how important I think this event is. Getting stakeholders involved in these issues is critical to the future of the region, and I think it's critical to good policy making. How do I get to this? Oops. Okay. For those of you who aren't familiar with PEC, Tim's already given you an overview of who we are. I'll be speaking to you mostly about the results of a survey we do on the state of the region. Our survey provides an opportunity for those who work on regional issues to provide feedback on what they think are the most pressing issues facing the Asia-Pacific economy. Let me underscore that this is not a survey of public opinion. These are people who work on regional and international issues closely. There's a reason we do this. The issues we ask about are often complex issues, and unless you follow these events quite closely, we suspect some of them you might never have heard of. So this is really a survey of about 600 policy experts from business, government, academia, civil society. I hope we can include some of you in the future so that we can get some of the youth views included. Now, sort of the good news is, and the first thing I want to say is that respondents to our survey are optimistic about the prospects for growth moving ahead. So 55% of respondents to our survey think that growth for the world economy will be stronger over the next 12 months. But if you have a look at that chart, 68% think that growth for the US will be stronger, 66% for China. So the way we see this is that generally people are more optimistic about the prospects for growth for those economies that achieved higher vaccination rates at the time the survey was undertaken. So I think this really underscores the urgency of more equitable distribution and delivery of vaccines across the region and the world to improve prospects for growth and minimize the risks of new variants emerging. We also asked respondents what they think are the top risks to growth for their economy. And this chart shows you the percent of respondents who selected each risk as a top 5 risk to growth. And the policy community is worried about, of course, future waves of COVID-19 and new variants, climate change, a lack of political leadership, increased protectionism and trade wars, a slowdown in trade growth, and a failure to implement structural reforms. Our interpretation of these perceptions is that they're all connected. We've heard a lot, I think, from people about the need to build back better from the crisis. And I think what these results tell us is concerns about the ability to do just that. Now, what we think is that regional cooperation can play a useful role in mitigating these risks. Capacity building where needed and building confidence in each other's direction of reforms. And I think that's where cooperation across the board plays a really important role. So when we talk about waves of COVID, what are we actually sort of talking about? This chart shows cases in the Asia Pacific, but indexed at 100 at their peak. Now, cases have affected different parts of the region at different times, and they've been transmitted across borders, no matter how stringent our domestic policies are. You know, one peak came at the end of 2020, then peaking again in May, and then we see increases again towards the end with the Delta variant. And I think it's clear why respondents to our survey were really worried about new waves. I think we also need to be reminded that this crisis has been huge. We've never seen anything like it. So just, you know, at the risk of being sort of repetitive, we've had about 250 million cases, about 5 million deaths. You know, estimates vary, maybe 6 million or so, 6 trillion or so in lost output. 245 million jobs have been lost. And just to say it again, according to the WHO, when a virus is widely circulating in a population and causing many infections, the likelihood of a virus mutating increases. So even if we manage to vaccinate everyone within our economies, we greatly risk new variants emerging unless we deal with the pandemic everywhere. And I think that really sort of underscores why we have to deal with this globally. So given that risk assessment of COVID, what do respondents believe are the policy priorities for dealing with the pandemic and its economic consequences? Not surprisingly, the top response was get on with vaccinations. That was the scope and pace of vaccinations within our economies. But if you have a look at the next two, this is a bit of a surprise. People movement. Firstly, those who work on the distribution of goods, those in the supply chain, and then second, common standards and recognition of vaccine passports. And then you get the donations of vaccines to developing countries through COVAX. But let me step back a bit and explain this list. We reviewed the various initiatives and ideas being proposed on how to deal with COVID. Those at the WTO, APEC, and G20. A lot of focus on the problems of how to deal with vaccine supply chains and equity issues. This is, if you like, the fantasy football of the policy world. No surprise at all that we need to vaccinate our populations. But the next two were both related to mobility. And I'm going to admit to you, this was not just a surprise to me. It was a complete shock. But when we write these reports, we anticipate somewhat what the answers might be. I thought we might get the WTO agreement, donations to COVAX. This is the bread and butter work that we do, support for the multilateral trade system. Reflecting on the results, I think we have to ask, why? The chart on the left is the international cost of transporting goods. The media has been full of reports of disruptions. And bear in mind that supply chains account for about 40% of pharmaceutical costs. Belly capacity, that's the belly of airplanes. The space and passenger aircraft was down 38%. Before the pandemic, the average cost of air freight of a 1 kg box was about $2.50. Now it's about $6. Shipping a 40-foot container used to be about $1,500. Now it's about $10,000 if you can get space in one of those container boats. What's driving higher prices? You have demand surges, temporary closures of ports, shortage of workers. You have the temporary closure of the Suez Canal blockage. You have the policy restrictions. What can you do about it? Well, there's some policy recommendations there. designate those working in supply chains as essential workers, mutual recognition of tests and vaccines, and so on. I won't go through those in detail. You may have seen some of these headlines in the newspapers. Workers who keep supply chains moving are warning of a system collapse, container shipping prices skyrocketing, and so on. That's the supply chain story. But there's a much more direct interest, which is tourism. On the left, that shows you the contribution of travel and tourism to GDP. For some economies in the region, travel and tourism contributes about 20% to GDP. For others, it's a bit less. That's in 2019. Over the course of the pandemic, that dropped for some by about 10%. That's a massive drop over the course of the pandemic. In terms of jobs, travel and tourism accounts for about 20% of employment, as much as 20%. For others, it's a bit less. For the region as a whole, the sector contributed about $5.4 trillion to the region's GDP. This fell to $2.7 trillion. It employed 208 million people in 2019. Over the course of the pandemic, that fell to 170 million. If you think about it, travel and tourism employs a disproportionate number of youth. As an example, in Canada, 1/3 of the youth account for about 1/3 of the employment in the sector, compared to sort of the average youth in the workforce of about a 10th. So it's a big problem for youth. Specifically for our region, we are really lagging behind when it comes to opening up. So the chart on the left compares the Asia Pacific to the EU. You can see that the EU has begun to open up, but sort of furthermore, the EU has developed the EU digital COVID certificate, which proves whether you've been vaccinated, have a negative test result, or have recovered from COVID. The issues we're confronting is that as economies do open up, there's a whole bunch of issues we're confronting. Which vaccines do we recognize? The easiest, I guess, would be the WHO list, but do economies recognize the authority who gave you the vaccine? Do they recognize your certificate? When do you need to do your PCR test before traveling? Is it 24 hours? Is it 72 hours? The cost of tests. Had a quick look at a database. In some places, it's $8. In other places, it's as much as $400. You don't want travel to become the domain of just wealthy people. It's a really challenging set of issues. Tansy Rebecca talked about the growth of the digital economy. Here we are on a digital platform. Before COVID, we were spending about 2 billion hours per quarter on these digital apps like this one. That's tripled over the course of the pandemic. I know you're going to have a session on this. It's been a real shot in the arm, if you forgive my pun, but there are a lot of policy issues that we're going to have to confront. According to our list, the top ones that came up in our survey were cybersecurity, data privacy, interoperability, cross-border digital transactions, digital trade, digital literacy. There's a whole load of issues that we're going to need to confront. Can you imagine if you had to go through this pandemic without the internet? But without international cooperation, without the platforms to do e-commerce, I think we'd all be a little bit stuck. So what are my conclusions? The economic recovery is underway, but we need to ensure the equitable distribution of vaccines. A sustained and inclusive recovery requires cooperation to minimize risks from future waves of the pandemic. Trade is critical to the production of vaccines, but people are critical to trade. Don't forget the people that actually make trade happen. They are at risk here. For a safe reopening, the travel and tourism sector, their contribution to jobs in the economy, the need for standardized protocols for reestablishing people-to-people connectivity. Does it make sense to decide all of this on our own, or do we use cooperation mechanisms to build confidence and trust in a safe reopening. Again, for a safe and for an inclusive and sustainable recovery. How are we dealing with climate change? That came up as a big risk. How are we dealing with digital issues? There are so many aspects to regional cooperation and international cooperation. I've got very limited time. We need to find solutions to these problems. I hope your voices will be heard. This is a great platform for discussing them. I look forward to hearing more of your recommendations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, for that excellent presentation. Those statistics really help put the pandemic into perspective. We'll come back to you for questions shortly, but first, our next speaker will address the same issue, but from a very different perspective. Afika Ramizi is from Malaysia and in her final year of medical studies in Auckland, New Zealand, where she also serves as president of the New Zealand International Students Association. She has had a front row seat in observing the way in which COVID-19 has affected young people, particularly those, like many of those watching today, whose studies take them to different parts of the Asia Pacific. Please welcome Afika.
Assalamualaikum and kia ora koutou katoa. Thank you, first of all, to the organizer and also for having me on this platform. So COVID-19 to me is like a long-haul, non-stop flight from Auckland to Doha or from New York to Singapore, taking about 18 to 19 hours one way. It is a journey full of anticipation to reach the destination, mixed with plenty of sleep, entertainment, and maybe work, as well as the feeling of exhaustion, boredom, or excitement. At least, that's how I would describe my experience when flying from my home country, Malaysia, to New Zealand. However, the prominent difference here is that seeing the light at the end of the tunnel for COVID-19 pandemic seems to still be far away. Globally, we are nearing the 2 years mark, and yet every month has been an ongoing battle between uncertainties, new learnings, and months-long lockdown for some of us. For the next few minutes, I would like to invite you into profiling 3 different youth as we dive deeper into my sharing of COVID-19. So Youth A, a student studying in a foreign country, living countries apart from their family, working a part-time job, separated from their loved ones due to global travel restrictions, and with limited access to national support services. Youth B, a young professional starting a new career with a keen attitude to explore their career and capabilities, yet having had to work from home with limited peer support and unable to fully immerse themselves in the new workplace culture. And finally, Youth C, a student studying in their home country, able to meet their families and friends locally, learning to navigate online education, perhaps with some internet restrictions, and unable to travel for overseas experience and new cultures. So each of the profile we just pictured is different, yet the stark similarities experienced by all are the new norms of digital disruptions, employment and educational shifts, and social separation. Within my role as the national president of the New Zealand International Students Association, I continuously hear our youth struggling with the prolonged separation from their loved ones and with transforming their education or employment from in-person to online. So chronic mental fatigue is now being widely talked about in movement spaces, leading to the creation of a term known as languishing, coined by a sociologist named Corey Keyes. Now you may ask, what is languishing? Well, I call it the prime emotion of 2021. It is not burnout. It is not depression. It is a sense of stagnation and dulled motivation, especially as we reflect on when will these uncertainties end? When will we get our life back? Through my experience as a medical student, we often encourage these individuals to exercise regularly, have good sleep, and stay connected socially. However, we know that there are multiple existing barriers to maintaining those healthy routines. And this is the reality that our youth are facing. While 70% of countries worldwide have adopted telehealth, which is the practice of providing healthcare virtually, there are still significant disparities in the uptake. Yes, we have taken big leaps and are moving towards a digital future, but we need to keep innovating. Governments and agencies must work together to create a safe digital environment for our youth. I'm not talking about censorship, but I'm talking about transparent and open source technology. So I resonate the most with Youth A. I have not seen my family back home for more than 2 years. I'm a migrant prone to homesickness and limited support, yet I still live my days studying and working, waiting for the time when more countries are ready for international travels to resume so I can see my family again. Often the speeches are about the future, but we need to talk about the current situations to ensure that the communities most stunted by this crisis are not left behind. Solutions and policies need to be crowdsourced to accurately reflect the needs of our wider population, while taking advantage of the creative thinkers present in our community. Now is the time when governments need to be the avid listener more than ever. A worldwide empowerment and acknowledgement of the youth voices in regional and national initiatives, to me, that is the new future. The priorities of our youth have changed. This is an open invitation to the APEC members, government, and agencies to confidently and continuously partner with our youth. And to the youth here, keep being the megaphones of your communities. Get connected with other youth from other countries. Embrace that bilateral exchange of knowledge and culture. Join me in this space of international cooperation so we can collectively combat COVID-19 impacts, extending to the facet of well-being, working and employment, and exploring. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Afika, for that thought-provoking address and for that call to action at the end there. We are now going to open up for comments and questions from our delegates, starting with those delegations that were part of the drafting group on international cooperation. So I'm going to call on Vietnam, then Japan, then Philippines. Vietnam, you first, over to you. Okay, it doesn't look like Vietnam's quite ready. So we'll ask Japan if you're there. Would you like to ask your question?
Hello. Thank you very much for your input. I have a question to Mr. Pedrosa. Regarding the supply chain, you mentioned the supply chain and transport issues and their higher prices. And I understand that these issues affect overall economy and also distribution of vaccine and other medical equipment. And is there anything that the youth can do regarding these issues? Thank you.
I think there needs to be a realization that these logistics issues impact all of us. That there's and how they impact all of us. There's been a considerable, as far as I'm concerned, sort of a lack of attention to these issues over the past 2 years. I mean, I think we knew about them, in fact, early on during the pandemic, that there were going to be problems. But unfortunately, the lack of cooperation on how we were going to deal with it has led to this sort of build-up in problems and a sort of cascade in problems. So it'd be very helpful if everyone, including the youth, sort of had a look at them and how they impact youth, how they impact supply chains, and how they impact everyone. And ask the question: how are they impacting everyone? So not just the supply chain issue, but how they impact students. If you think of how big, for example, the education sector is in New Zealand, how big it is in Malaysia, how big it is in Australia, those are considerable contributions to the economy. And international students contribute everywhere. Have those voices really been heard? And I think it's important to take a sort of an ecosystem approach. So I've taken one part of that, but if you think of how important that sort of travel is to the entire system. So I talked a little bit about belly capacity, but you won't solve belly capacity without having international travelers. So the business community, in fact, has been very sort of active in saying we need to get business travel going, but international students are important too. They travel too, and I'd like Afika to be able to see her family, and I'm sure you'd all like to see your families too. So think about your economic interests in this as well.
Thank you, Eduardo. Now the Philippines, are you there with your question? Perhaps not. I might ask again if Vietnam has come back, if we have a question from Vietnam. No. All right. Well, I might put a question to both of you then. And I'd be quite interested. We've talked a lot about people movement. What would you say is the number one thing that APEC members can do to support the movement for tourism and education, everything that we've been talking about today?
It's very clear that we need to make sure that we've got our health, that health is the overriding imperative in all of this. There's no doubt about that in my mind. But that doesn't mean that we can't have a safe reopening, that we can't have protocols that allow people like Afika to move.
Do we know?
We just need to find ways that facilitate that movement safely. So having a conversation amongst the regulatory agencies that allow that process to happen. And APEC's a great place to have that conversation. I mentioned during my presentation the EU digital certificate. That's one way of doing that. But that's a very different system. But something that allows a mutual recognition of those certificates is one possible way forward. There are loads of other certificates being proposed around the world. I don't think we want a spaghetti bowl of those, but I think we want a system that allows people to move easily. What we want to avoid is something that sort of raises the cost of all of this around the world for everyone. So we've had tourism grow because you've had cheaper flights. You don't want to sort of add costs to international travel.
And Afika, do you have a comment on that?
I was going to say a universal vaccine passport recognition, in my opinion, is the way to safely open the borders and also perhaps to regain the resilience and our economic recovery for all the sectors that play a big role in each country.
Thank you. Great point. I've heard now that Philippines is ready to try again with their question. So Philippines, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Hello, Aotearoa everyone, and mabuhay from the Philippines. So I have our question. Despite the government's critical role, especially now in the COVID-19 pandemic, it's widely believed that civil society organizations, schools, and youth organizations are important towards adding value to the economy's perspectives, particularly to international cooperation. So my question, or our question is, how can civil society organizations, youth organizations, and other entities, such as schools, ensure that the APEC member economies will do substantial and sustainable international cooperation, both to combat COVID-19, but also to build a better world for all and new normal, and ensure the APEC's effect to the economy, states, and situations? Thank you so much.
Who'd like to go first? Eduardo, would you like to respond first?
Sure. APEC's a very unusual organization, and in fact, it's very open to stakeholder engagement. I think you have to monitor what particular work programs that you're interested in. PEC is one of the official observers, and we are a multi-stakeholder organization, and we do include various civil society organizations through our member committees. So that's one way.
Have we got any other questions to come through?
We have a lot of academic and sort of non-government organizations that participate through our member committees. There are various other organizations that participate in the APEC process. The Asia Association of Pacific Rim Universities, Tansy Rebecca mentioned the Asia Foundation. APEC's a very open organization, so it includes ABAC, the business arm. One of the great things about the Putrajaya Vision 2040 is that they asked for greater stakeholder engagement in that. So have a look at that. Think about what your interests are, and take Tansy Rebecca at her word. She wants to hear more from you, especially more from the youth, because that's a 2040 vision. And that's 20 years from now. So have a think about that.
Thank you. Afika.
I think one of my key learnings from the president role is that every organization, every institution has their own interest within this time of pandemic. So what I would say is to collaborate together with other organizations and also with APEC, so that everyone will have the equal opportunities to share what really matters to them and what they would like to focus on moving forward. And also, just a suggestion, I think there are definitely benefits to having more outreach to the younger and youth communities from APEC, so that people will know more about what APEC is doing. Thank you.
I might put one final question to you both and just ask, how quickly do you both expect international education to recover from the pandemic? Very difficult question to answer, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
It's the impact on education has been really the impact's been very differentiated. So where I come from in the Philippines, it's been online up till now, whereas where I live in Singapore, kids are already back at school. So the impact's been really differentiated across the world. There have been all kinds of sort of econometric studies on the productivity losses because of the pandemic, and sort of the calculation for East Asia has been a potential loss of about 1.5% over the next 20 years. And a lot of that is because of losses in education. So it's going to take that long because of the sort of losses to human capital that we're suffering over this time. So without really proactive policy actions to deal with that, we're really in a very difficult place. So that's one area where we'd really like to hear from youth on how you think you've suffered and what can be done to make up for those potential losses. I mean, Afika, you're a medical student. Can you imagine without doing practical hands-on work, it's going to be very hard to be a medical student. I can't imagine doing that online.
Yeah, 100%. I think I echo what Mr. Eduardo just said. It really depends on how ready or how advanced the country is with their international education strategies and policies. I think New Zealand is doing well on the end. We are opening more of our borders to invite more international students to enter New Zealand, but definitely there are still more things to work on. Our international education ecosystem has changed. Like Mr. Eduardo just said, for me, it's hard to do my medical studies online, and there are many other students who are equally impacted. So really encourage everyone to come together and talk about how the challenges have been for our international students, what can we do to support them, and what kind of support would really be useful for them instead of what we think would be useful for them.
Thank you very much, Afika and Eduardo. This has been a really stimulating conversation on the need to cooperate internationally to work through COVID-19. Thank you both so much for joining us today. We are now going to take a look at a few more of those delegate videos that you have sent through to us.
Nowadays, we the youth are in the middle of a complete dilemma, and the only way to address it is with all sectors of society and all generations. The previous generation lived through the Great Recession in 2008, but now our generation is facing greater challenges that are modeling our future. Among the setbacks in access to education due to school closures, the worsening of unemployment rates, and the increasing protests and social movements, we, the young people, are growing as individuals in the middle of an uncertain scenario of socio-economic unrest.
It is worth saying that our economy is facing common challenges, just like the others.
For example, in addition to being on the verge of an economic recovery and a very positive projected growth, Chile carried out a rapid vaccination process, which was globally recognized and celebrated. Despite these wise decisions, other concerns about our society have been ignored. Unfortunately, this fact has left a mark due to the rise of droughts, frost, pouring rains in short periods of time, the rise of sea level and forest fires, as well as the decrease of rainfall, the biodiversity loss, and economic damages due to the decrease of animal and agricultural production.
Hence, this makes us realize that all of these actions are interconnected, not only at a national level, but at an international level. Looking to encourage a sustainable recovery, it is important that the economies promote public policies from a systems change perspective, holistic views that take the problem from its roots to promote long-term solutions based on collaboration, harmonizing economic growth, social inclusion, and environmental protection together, thereby obtaining real results that change the global paradigm.
Here's when cooperation becomes relevant, since we cannot expect to find national solutions to international problems. In fact, one of the most important lessons to be drawn from this pandemic, particularly in the scientific field, is how significant international cooperation is, which has been, in this case, for instance, fundamental for vaccine development, proving that the economies need to come back to multilateralism in all the foreign policy duties.
The time for action is now, and solutions must be guided towards the future.
The pandemic offers an opportunity for Asia and the Pacific to undertake reforms that can make the region more resilient in different areas, such as supply chains, urban development, and climate action.
The recovery of the pandemic cannot only be a rebuilding of previous disasters,
but also a unique opportunity for improvement and entrepreneurship.
Thank you very much, Chile. I'm so impressed with these videos that you have submitted. It is now my pleasure to invite some comments from a guest joining us from Singapore, the Minister of State for Trade and Industry and Culture, Community and Youth, Alvin Tan. Minister Tan's CV is a remarkable mix of youth activism, business, including stints at LinkedIn, Facebook and Goldman Sachs, and work for international organisations, notably the UN and Oxfam. I now invite Minister Tan to give us some remarks.
Thank you. Dear youth and participants, educators, thank you for letting me join you at the APEC Voices of the Youth Future Summit today. It's 2021 and a year has quickly passed. I remember having an engaging discussion last year on the topic of APEC Reimagined, priorities in the aftermath of COVID. While COVID is still here, we have not yet overcome the challenges, but last year I've had the real opportunity and the honor to discuss some of what we hope we will tackle post-COVID with Dr. Nolene Hazer, Mr. Ho Meng Kit, and very ably facilitated by Mr. Viswa Sadasivan. That was in November last year. We spoke about that in the aftermath if we got past COVID, but this year's theme is a little bit different. It's about international cooperation to combat COVID-19, looking ahead, the digital future, a greener future, and a future for all. And it is a very timely discussion, a very timely topic. Timely, why? Because our future, your future, depends on what we all do today, on and with COVID, with computers, and with climate change. We now all know, and it's become quite banal now, that COVID has changed our world, but perhaps irrevocably. COVID-19 has accelerated the use of technology, effectively computers, and brought climate change to the front and center. Our APEC economies are working together to help us to recover and emerge from COVID-19. And New Zealand's strong leadership and stewardship this year has put us on a good footing, good stead, as we build a digitally enabled and sustainable future that is both inclusive and able to deliver benefits to all members of society. Let's first begin with digitalization. The first C, computers. Right now, we have computers in our pockets, our wrists, our vehicles, our robots, almost everywhere. And this digitalization trend will continue to change how we live, work, and play. It already has. We already know that COVID-19 has catalyzed significant digital transformations across the various aspects of our lives. And today, digitalization is no longer only about efficiency. In fact, it is vital to economic recovery. And for many sectors, many businesses that I've spoken to, the concept of how you survive, business survival. So with these shifts, there are also fresh opportunities to challenge and continually disrupt the status quo. If you look at a McKinsey study recently, it found that COVID-19 has accelerated the digitalization of products and services globally by 7 years, and more than 10 years here in the Asia Pacific. So 7 years worldwide, more than 10 years in the Asia Pacific. So we've gone through a time machine, effectively, a time warp. And many of you are already buying goods and services online every single microsecond. In this borderless world, we must constantly reinvent ourselves. And this reinvention must take place across all levels, both as a region, as a country, as a business, as well as a consumer. COVID-19 has also reminded us how inextricably independent or interdependent we are, and how we need to reinforce our partnerships and how, in effect, we work with one another. We must recognize that economic prosperity happens only when we engage like-minded partners to build a rules-based digital collective that is neutral, interoperable, and standards-based. So it's not just talking, it's how do we put together all of these different frameworks in place so that we can work more smartly and more effectively. Let me turn to how APEC can do this and what role APEC can play. Well, APEC can and must continue to use its role as an incubator of ideas to help us to cooperate digitally. In responding to the new normal, APEC economies can and must continue to work together to create a conducive digital ecosystem. This digital ecosystem must support cross-border transactions, including interoperable standards across data systems and cross-border data flows. To put this simply, it means that computers effectively must speak to one another. Passports must speak to one another so that we can effectively put through and get cross-border transactions effectively. You know, if you purchase something, you must be able to purchase, you must be able to receive that transaction. How do we do this? We need to continue implementing the good work done on both the APEC Internet and Digital Economy, or what we call IDA work program, and how we implement APEC cross-border privacy rules, CBPR. Both are very important. Let me just explain in quite simple terms what both means. The first one, ADA, is effectively a framework that provides guidance on how to facilitate technological and policy exchanges among member economies, what I mentioned earlier on. It will help us to promote innovative, inclusive, and sustainable growth and bridge the digital divide in the APEC region, something in which my good friend Eduardo mentioned earlier on, right? So these platforms, IDA, for example, helps us to build and bridge the digital divide within APEC. The second is the APEC CBPR. Now that's a mouthful, but what does that do? Well, even as we accelerate the digital growth, we need to be wary of privacy. So the APEC CBPR system is a certification system which allows certified organizations in participating APEC economies to exchange personal data seamlessly. And we hope securely as well. So we must also ensure that all of these efforts help to increase digital literacy and inclusivity among our communities, and also improve the resilience of the most important members of our economy, and that's our micro, small, and medium enterprises, MSMEs. These MSMEs play a significant role in our communities and our economies. So I've spoken about computers, which is digitalization. The second trend that COVID-19 has accelerated in quite earnest manner is something which is not new to many of our youth today, and in fact is foremost on your minds, and that's climate change. As I mentioned earlier, COVID-19 has brought to the forefront global sustainability and climate change issues. What can we do to protect our planet and ensure a sustainable future? We all know, we all acknowledge that climate change is one of the gravest threats facing mankind. In the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC report, it highlighted that global temperatures are expected to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming over the next 2 decades, just over the next 2 decades. And even right now, we are already seeing weather extremes. In June and July, we witnessed unprecedented heat waves in the US and Canada, and extreme rainfall caused widespread flooding in Europe and China. Back home here in Singapore, we've also seen more extreme weather events in recent years, such as periods of intense rainfall causing flash floods. And for a low-lying island city like Singapore, the increased frequency of extreme weather conditions can potentially disrupt access to critical resources. But we all know that climate change is a global, complex, and very difficult challenge. So to achieve our sustainability goals, it is really needless to say that we need all sectors of society, governments, businesses, citizens, and international cooperation. We are actively working with fellow APEC countries on a few joint initiatives to tackle climate change. For example, in last October, we signed an MOU with Australia to advance cooperation on low emissions technologies and solutions, including on hydrogen and carbon capture, utilization, and storage, more easily known as CCUS. We are also collaborating with Chile and New Zealand on low carbon hydrogen. And APEC must continue to make steadfast progress on its mandate to promote sustainable development. And indeed, APEC is very much well placed to discuss the changes needed to decarbonize our energy, facilitate green financing, and most importantly, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So what can you as youth do? As future leaders of the world, every single one of you play a crucial role in the world's sustainability efforts. In Singapore, our youth have shown a deep interest in environmental issues. A recent poll conducted by our National Youth Council revealed that youth consistently rank sustainability as one of the top areas requiring attention. We must therefore empower our youth to come up with solutions to tackle the critical issues brought about by climate change. Singapore recently launched our SG Green Plan 2030 this year to help us execute our sustainable development efforts and achieve net zero emissions. It is a whole of nation roadmap focusing on 5 main pillars: city in nature, sustainable living, energy reset, the green economy, and a resilient future. With a greater stake in the future, our youth are also participating in international climate forums more actively. This year, more than 400 youth climate leaders from 186 countries convened at the Youth for Climate event as part of the pre-COP summit. The emphasis on youth voices is further reflected with youth and public empowerment established as one of the daily themes at the ongoing COP26, even as we speak. Last month, our National Youth Council launched the 3rd season of our Youth Action Challenge, a program for our youth to initiate solutions with the guidance of industry experts, youth leaders, and government agencies. So far, more than 100 youths have signed up for the track on environment and sustainability. What will they be doing? Well, they'll be working on solutions for sustainable living, sustainable tourism, and our energy reset. It is key that as a nation and as a community, we must continue to have very frank and candid discussions to understand the various perspectives and encourage participation in our sustainable development goals, and to ensure that no one is left behind in the process. So to our youth here today, what can and should you do to contribute to the journey, in our collective journey for a brighter future? If I could quote Singapore's founding Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, he said, "You need, besides determination, all the other attributes that would push a project along. you must have application, you must be prepared to work hard, and you must be prepared to get people to work with you. So let's do just that. Walk the talk, encourage our friends, our families, our people to work alongside us as we face these challenges head on and take these opportunities with verve and energy. Thank you.
Minister, thank you very much for a very interesting address and some great advice there for our delegates. Thanks so much for your time joining us today at Voices of the Future. We now come to the second session for today, Digital Future. There is no better evidence of a digital future than the meeting we are holding right here, right now. One of 300 meetings being held online for APEC in 2021, and one of millions that are now held every day around the world as people shift from dealing in person to on screen. Young people are, of course, masters of digital technology, so what you think about the digital future will, to a large extent, help shape the future. We're going to begin this session by asking the lead drafters of the Digital Future section of the Youth Declaration to summarise its contents. Welcome to Stephanie Palitza from Peru and Megan Litz from the United States to take us through this.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here representing APEC's youth. I'm Stephanie Palitza, lead drafter of the Digital Future segment of the Youth Declaration and part of the Peruvian Economy Delegation. Papua New Guinea, Peru, Singapore, Thailand, and the US were part of the Digital Future drafting group, and we identified as our main areas of interest: first, digital connectivity and accessibility; second, investing in digital education; third, cybersecurity and combating disinformation; and fourth, prioritizing cyber wellness and positive social media use. Regarding the first priority, we call for increased digital connectivity through overcoming coverage and affordability barriers. We encourage APEC leaders to strengthen international cooperation to build and maintain resilient connectivity infrastructure for all, taking into account the geographical and cultural differences of each economy, and promote public and private sector cooperation to provide infrastructure for rural communities and low-income urban populations. About the second priority, while most people think that youth are often the most digitally literate population, in reality, many lack the required skills to achieve a productive and creative digital future. Because of this, we urge APEC leaders to promote private investment in educational material and hardware infrastructure to run digital literacy programs and implement public funding capacity building programs at all levels of education to increase female representation in STEM and entrepreneurship. I give the floor to Megan from the US Economy to explain the next two priorities.
Thank you. As we've experienced an uptake in the necessity of technology, we must ensure the security and integrity in the flow of information. Knowledge is a powerful tool and must be protected. Rules must be established, but freedom of speech must be protected from potential encroachment of censorship. We must enforce digital responsibilities via establishing independent fact checkers and hold technology companies accountable to protect the consumer. There also needs to be laws created to protect data and privacy. As social media has become widespread, it presents both benefits and threats to the well-being of young people. We must not allow technology to replace what humans can do, but we must encourage technology companies to collaborate with organizations and advocacy groups to address the internet addictions through promoting offline human interaction and activity. Standards must be upheld to ensure harmful trends are being monitored, and tech companies must understand that they are dealing with human beings and not just product consumers. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you for that summary. We now come to the lead speaker for the session. Susan Wojcicki, CEO of YouTube, is a major figure in the tech industry. It was in her garage in Menlo Park that Google took its first steps into business. It was clearly some garage. Since then, Susan has moved from the garage to the boardroom, playing a major part in the company ever since, notably managing its acquisition of YouTube in 2006. Today, YouTube is the world's most popular portal for streamed video with over 2 billion viewers per month. Susan is sitting down with New Zealand YouTuber Sarah Crisp to talk all things digital, including the effects of the pandemic on our education and what our digital future might look like. It is my pleasure to introduce this conversation with YouTube CEO Susan Wojcicki.
Hi, Susan. Hello. We're so excited that you can join us here today at Voices of the Future.
Well, thank you for having me, Sarah. I'm excited to be here and look forward to our conversation.
I'm, of course, looking forward to chatting with you too, and also to be a part of Voices of the Future, because I genuinely believe that it's never been more important than it is now for young people's voices to be heard. For me and my YouTube channel, that's, of course, been helping people take things that they're passionate about and then turning them into digital businesses. And so that leads me onto my question for you, which is this. What do you see as one of the biggest benefits of YouTube for this young generation, as well as for the communities and countries that they live in?
Well, thank you so much for that question. And I love the way you talked about being able to take your passion and turn that into a business. And just the fact that we are able to offer so much content about so many different topics. And that's because of creators like you who can take their passion and turn that into a business. And right now on YouTube, we have over 2 million creators who are generating revenue. And they're all doing that about content that they're interested in, they're passionate about. And I remember when I was growing up, there were just a small number of, I'm embarrassed to say how many channels there probably were, certainly less than 100, but only a couple that were ones that I would watch or had content that was relevant for me. And so now the fact that there are literally millions and millions of channels and that people can take their passion and turn that into a business. And that has really added up to a lot. We've seen that in the past 3 years, we've actually paid out over $30 billion to creators and artists and organizations generating revenue on YouTube. And we also see it's made a really big difference for the economies that they work in. So, for example, so we've tried to quantify that. We went to this to the Oxford Economic Institute, and they have done a number of reports for us. And some of the most recent reports were in Asia, around South Korea, where we saw that the creator economy was generating over 1.6 billion won. And generating over 80,000 jobs. So those were big numbers, and we were excited to see that. And then if we look at something like Australia, we saw over 600 billion Australian dollars and over 15,000 jobs. So those are very significant numbers just in terms of how YouTube is contributing to the economy. And we're so glad to be part of it and work with creators like you.
Something that I see a lot of people sort of misunderstand is that, they see YouTube as just a place for telling stories and things like that. But, as you know, and as I know through personal experience, YouTube can, empower you to create so many different things. And, stories is just one of those things. And so, for example, like you think about when COVID hit, a lot of people went online to keep up with important things in life, especially students who need to keep up with classes. And so, now as a result, so many of us are rethinking what education might look like in the future. So my question for you then is this. How are you thinking about learning at YouTube?
Well, learning at YouTube is a really big topic for us. And we see that YouTube in many ways is this next generation library where you can come and you can look up anything, and you can do that for free. So if you want to look up a speech, or you want to learn a topic, learn how to play an instrument, how to fix something, you can do all of that on YouTube. And that's just been an amazing learning opportunity. And when I meet people and they find out that I'm the CEO of YouTube, they almost always then tell me a story about something they learned on YouTube. Like, oh, you wouldn't believe it, this thing happened, and I learned it on YouTube. And we saw during the pandemic, people were cut off from their communities and they needed to fix things in their house or learn skills that things they never anticipated that they would have to learn before. And we saw a lot of people turning to YouTube to learn those skills. And then with so many schools being closed and kids out of school, YouTube just became a more important resource than ever for helping from an educational standpoint. And so we're really leaning into the educational learning parts of YouTube, and you'll see us continue to do a lot more there. So Sarah, your channel focuses on teaching people business skills, which I think is so fantastic. And I would love to know during the pandemic, how did your channel change, or how did you respond to the pandemic, and how did that change the content and interactions that you had with your users?
Well, It was honestly a pretty big roller coaster. At first, the traffic and the views to my channel plummeted and they fell off a massive cliff because everyone was just watching news and they weren't doing much else. But within a week, once lockdown started, the opposite happened. The views skyrocketed, the engagement, likes, comments, things like that, they also skyrocketed too. It's estimated that about 5 years worth of growth in the e-commerce industry happened in about less than a year because very suddenly a lot of people saw that that people were shifting their buying behavior. Previously, they would have gone and bought items in person, but now they are buying items online. And so I saw traffic to my e-commerce tutorials increase because my viewers were seeing this change. And they realized that there was the sudden demand that had also caused this big gap in the market and that lots of new businesses and new stores needed to be created to fill it. And so they were using my e-commerce tutorials to start their own online stores to fill this gap. And seeing their lives change through the businesses that they've launched through it has honestly been really amazing. What else have you seen on YouTube that speaks to how our digital lives are changing?
So we definitely also saw an acceleration. You mentioned the digital acceleration, and we saw that for sure too, with lots of people recognizing how much change was happening. And we saw at first a lot of people coming to us for both health information as well as learning education content. And both of those verticals were highly impacted by the pandemic. So with regard to health, we have really invested in making sure we have authoritative information. And we serve so many, hundreds of billions of impressions to make sure that we were able to get authoritative health information out to our users. And same thing with learning. We saw so many people who had to learn a skill, schools that were reaching out. And so we definitely invested a lot more there. But then we saw live streaming being also a really big trend. So many people were cut off from their communities, whether it was their religious organization, their family, their community, and concerts couldn't happen. And so that was a trend. It was just great to see how we could connect people digitally and they could come together in that way.
Yeah, no, it was amazing that YouTube was able to be an educational platform on that issue, like you mentioned. Which actually brings me on to my next question for you, because another key theme for this year is, of course, another very important issue too. It's on finding solutions for a greener future. So, what do you see as YouTube's role in helping combat climate change and building a sustainable future?
Well, sustainability is a top issue that we see. Our users care deeply about that issue, and we offer so much information on that topic, and that's one of the advantages of having so many different channels is whatever you want to learn, whether you're interested in the science behind climate change, the politics, the actions, how you can change your life, all of that content we'll have available on YouTube, and we'll have that many different versions and many different creators speaking out on that, and then we'll have that in all languages for people to be able to research and to understand that a lot better. We've really focused on making sure that we have authoritative information and that information is raised up for our users. And then when there's information, for example, with climate denial, that's content we don't monetize. So we want to make sure that it can't be something that you can't be building a business out of the climate denial.
It's amazing to hear how you've been thinking about, these important issues, that are facing young people today. But also, given that we have so many amazing leaders with us here today, I wanted to end with a little bit of a different question. So, what advice would you give everyone in facing adversity and tackling really tough challenges? But most importantly, what I want to know is what has worked well for you?
So I recommend always thinking about really what's meaningful, what's that mission, how can you make the world better? And if you have passion around it, then you're going to get through the hard times. And also say that being persistent is really, really important. And it's not always going to be easy, but if you just keep at it and you believe in that mission, you will get there and you'll see progress, and it will be meaningful.
Oh.
Thank you so much, and I love your channel, and small businesses play such an important role in society, so it's great to see that you're helping and providing that support and educational content. So good luck with everything. I'll let you know if
Thank
I
you.
come to New Zealand.
Yes, love to have you.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay, bye. Take care.
Thank you very much, Susan and Sarah, for that great conversation. Susan, you'd be most welcome back to New Zealand as soon as you can get here. I would now like to turn to our second speaker, Susan Chen. Susan characterises herself as a global nomad, but is clearly very much at home in the IT industry, currently working for a gaming company in Singapore. Susan will be sharing her views on some implications of digital technologies for emerging economies. Susan, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. And what a wonderful speaker lineup. And I really love how everyone talked about digital inclusion, acceleration, and what that means in the work that we all do. And today I want to sort of dive into a little bit more from a reflection point of view. So I spent 4 years, so before moving back to Singapore, I spent 4 years living in Indonesia, working with tech entrepreneurs on transforming life through digital transformation. And very much of that transformation is through digital inclusion. And I work in primary healthcare transformations in second and third tier cities of Indonesia, and also very much work for a shared economy unicorn platform, which is focusing on making social impact through bringing shadow economy through the forefront of society, which links to financial inclusion and very much, again, using digital inclusion as a platform. And again, reflecting on the speakers today that talk about digital acceleration, just listening to Susan from YouTube, talking about the digital inclusion through content creation and consumption, and also, again, hearing the youth declarations around connectivity and safety. Something I've always been thinking about and reflecting on is how inclusion can be very much exclusive. So I want to pause here and I want all of you to think about, as we spend the time to talk about the power of digital inclusion, how about the potential for that being a real point of exclusion? Before I go into deeper, I want to mention, when we talk about digital inclusion, it may mean many different things to many people. So, highlighting, just referencing the National Digital Inclusion Alliances, we think about 5 elements of digital inclusion, which is about having affordable, robust, broadband internet services, having devices that is internet enabled, access to digital literacy training, quality technical support, and application of online content that designed to enable and encourage self-sufficiency, participation, and collaboration, which is everything that we heard from all the speakers today. And again, I want to sort of think about what are the intentional strategy and investment to reduce and eliminate historical, institutional, and structural barriers to this access and use of technology. And this is really important because through the time that I've spent in the developing nations looking at digital inclusion, I've experienced how it can bring people together through digital inclusion, but at the same time, I've observed how the gaps actually gets wider and wider for those that are actually hardest to reach. So my question to all of you is, when we think about these 5 things, what could be missing in this formula? Right, so we have the hardware approach, which is very much about the internet services, is about appropriate devices, is about meaningful content. We also have a software, what I consider as outside-in approach, which is the quality technical support, digital literacy training. We're bringing these in, right, outside into those that we're working with. But what could be missing in this formula? If we're thinking about sustainability, I heard today, from an environmental perspective, there's also a huge element of sustainability from the people that we work with, from the society that we're impacting. So what about the sustainability of this? And simply having these 5, is that actually enough? That's my question to all of you. Is that enough? And today I want to offer my reflection and a view of there's one critical piece that is missing, which is actually what I call the humanware, right? The growth mindset, the inside out approach. When we think about digital inclusion, how do we explore and develop what makes human human? And what makes us human is actually outside the technology. So I want to pause there and again share the reflection of how we think about digital inclusion is so much more than bringing people onto the platform, but also what is the opportunity actually to explore and develop deeper what makes us human. So what does that inside out approach look like? So making us human outside of technology is actually all about community. How do we combine our community experience offline with online? And that's not as simple as providing support. How do we truly integrate the change within the community? So when I was working in Indonesia, I have seen both digital transformation be successful and fail. And one of the key differentiator is how do we integrate the community offline, truly engaging in their online presence and inclusion, which also means there are actually a lot more things that we should be focusing on, such as life skills to be practiced outside of the digital world. I hear a lot, we talk about digital inclusion through digital literacy, but sometimes we forget in our community, the baseline of literacy is actually not there. So how do we also invest in the next generation through education and off the platform? Social changes doesn't happen just because we introduce a platform. True social change changes when we invest in a community. Technology is only a gateway, a vehicle to the change and transformation. So how do we invest in the next generation through education? And I'm a big advocate of how we think about these transformation with online and offline, where books, print, pen and paper will still be an integral part of that digital transformation. So I want to encourage all of you, when you think about digital transformation, you're not thinking about removing the books, removing the prints, removing the pen, removing the paper, removing the heart and the people. You're thinking about how do I integrate? How do I think about the generation we're changing now? Today, they are operating, they are enjoying, they are participating on the digital platform, but also the generation after. So examples of this I've seen in life is in the shared economy platform. While we bring the shadow economy to the forefront, giving them a online shop to allow them to sell their goods and services, we're actually investing in their children. We say, come and learn. How can you be part of the future that where digital is a big part of it, but a lot of that engagement is still very offline and within the society. So again, just to close off and conclude is to remind all of us, as a voice of the future, we have to identify the ecosystem that does not rely only on digital engagement with our current generation. We need to be more people and heart and sustainability centric in solving our inclusion problems and not be technology centric. We need to think from the community perspective rather than just our own and our experiences. So with this, I'm going to challenge all of you to think about how can you bring digital inclusion in a manner that is more sustainable and offline. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. That was a really interesting address there, and you've given us a lot to think about. I hear that we've got quite a few comments and questions to come in. I'm going to go to Thailand, then Papua New Guinea, and then Singapore for questions. So please get ready. Thailand, over to you first.
Hi, hello. First of all, on behalf of the youth delegates from Thailand, I would like to thank all the guest speakers for great insight. I would like to ask Susan Wojcicki a couple questions. First, undoubtedly, you're one of the most influential in the tech industry. As a role model, so to speak, what are your thoughts on the role of women in tech? And to be more precise, what are the current hindrances to women in this industry? And if possible, what steps should we take to overcome these obstacles? And second, if you don't mind answering a more specific question regarding the YouTube platform, with regard to a regulatory aspect of the digital platform, what is YouTube policy on hate speech and freedom of speech, specifically content censorship, as the youth are more likely to push the status quo? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. And it's lovely that we have two speakers, both Susan and female, in this session. So I think it's such a great setting for this question. So going back to when you talk about what are the key challenges or the opportunity actually for women in tech, I think there's an opportunity, as I mentioned earlier, about thinking about a community that is often being not overlooked, I think, in particular in the emerging sort of economies, right? So again, when we talk about digital transformation, my observation and also my experience so far in the sort of emerging kind of workforce is still very much male dominated. So how do we take a more diverse approach to think about the different role of women in these community, and how can they take a very different integrated role to the transformation together with the leaders? I think will be a great approach to move forward when we think about female leaders in tech. But at the same time, you know, the second question of what are my advice to sort of the voice of tomorrow, the delegates today, about how do we overcome some of these key challenging barriers, I think it's important that we address a different role of women, but as we move into leadership roles, that there isn't a tendency to feel like we have to expect leadership or look the same way. I think there is, how do we truly think about authenticity of leadership independent to a gender construct? So again, going back to a involvement of our community, understand the differences of the maturity of the community that we're working together with and transforming together, and really embracing the strength of women in this community. But as female leaders, how do we live in a way that's authentic to ourselves, but that is outside to the social construct of female leadership?
It's fantastic. Thank you very much, Susan. Now, Papua New Guinea, are you there with your question?
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Kia ora. I am Zaria Graman from the Papua New Guinea delegation, and on behalf of our member economy, we would like to say thank you to the guest speaker and for this opportunity for letting us speak. My question is, with so many opportunities presented to internet users as the screen time continues to increase with pandemic restrictions, what is one suggestion of an immediate action that you would like to challenge the APEC youth with, that we can take on immediately following the Voices of the Future program?
Wow, that is such a good question, and partly reflecting both experience working in the emerging market and now working in the gaming industry. I'm very, very well aware of the screen time and research around that have really changed sort of our youth behavior, you know, regardless what sort of platform and content you're consuming. To answer your question, what the opportunity to act, I think, more immediately, I think actually is all about being intentional of not just your consumption, but your contribution. Because a lot of time when we're consuming content, we're interacting with, whether it's players or shoppers or people that you're working with online, in a way that sometimes we're not even aware of that interaction. All right, so I think the most immediate action for all of us is how do we be much more intentional in our behavior, in our interaction within these additional screen time. I don't necessarily believe it's about cutting the screen time, but it's how do we improve the quality of our interaction? How do we make sure what we put out there within either is the content that we're looking at or sharing? You know, it goes back to, there was a lot of conversation about, you know, fake news or quality of content. How are we taking part in that sort of information world? And then, or, you know, in the context of gaming, when we're interacting with other players, how are we behaving and how are we actually interacting with those are on the platform with us? I think will be something that's within our control and something that we can work on immediately, having that intentional approach to think about the way that we are presenting ourselves, the way that we're showing up in these online engagements.
Thank you, Susan and Papua New Guinea for that great question. Singapore, could we come to you for your question, please?
Thanks again for your presentation. Your perspective on humanware was very insightful. My question is, on behalf of the Singapore delegation, what is your opinion on government and tech companies working together on issues like data privacy regulation and cybersecurity?
Wow. Hello, Singapore. I am sitting in Singapore having this conversation with you. So thank you for the great question. I think, so going back to your question, much more around government and tech companies working together around data privacy and security. I think there's always, again, I think a partnership in terms of integration. I think there's a great opportunity for the key tech partners and the government working together. But I think, when we talk about data privacy, when we talk about how we use data, they're much more complex than just about two big, powerful giants working together. I do think one of the opportunity is how do we make sure these partnerships really understand the community that we work and serve in. Goes back to what I've been talking about through this time, is about the community that we work together. So the opportunity, I think, again, is to how do we utilize the strength both the government have and the tech company, but then how do we not forget the community that we operate and serve in? So I think my view is just how do we truly embed our community's voice, the voice of not just our youth, but also the community that are going to be impacted by whatever that is the regulation decisions that are made coming out from these partnerships that is truly represented for the growth of our community. And again, I think when we think about partnership, I also think to call out, it will look quite different depending on the maturity of our infrastructure and understanding, and again, the ability to think through content partnership within the different APEC countries. So it's really important with everything that I think I've talked about is that we don't take a best practice and one size fits all approach to solve some of these partnerships, but really recognize the needs of each of the country are quite different. And I give a very quick example of when I've worked in Indonesia, where our core focus is really bringing that sort of society community into a economy away from the shadow economy. The privacy of the data takes a second step. It was more important for us to focus on inclusion in a meaningful way, which sometimes means that we need the data in order to drive behavior change, in order to drive sustainable approach to growth. Which will look very different to mature nations like Singapore. So again, I will encourage all of us to think about not a one size fits all or best practice approach to solve these problems, and really think through what is meaningful for the nations and the community we're working together and partnering with, and then recognizing is a roadmap to that partnership rather than fixing a status quo and getting a resolution in a more immediate term.
Thanks so much, Susan. I'm glad you touched on working in other countries as well, because I know that you describe yourself as a bit of a nomad, and I had a question for you on that. So you've answered that for me. Thank you very much for your time with us today and sharing your fascinating story. Now, before we play more delegate videos, we would like to share the outcome of this year's APEC App Challenge with you. The App Challenge is sponsored by Google and the Asia Foundation every year. We've heard a little bit about it earlier today. It challenges young app designers to create products that bridge the gap between APEC priorities and the needs of the digital marketplace. Let's take a look at the outcome of this year's App Challenge that was announced during the APEC Trade Ministers meeting earlier this year, and then we'll play some content provided by delegates.
The APEC App Challenge. This has been a long-standing tradition now in APEC to connect the policy that we look at to the digital. So we should acknowledge at the start the enormous uncertainty across our region and the fact that our tourism sectors have been so hard hit. And this is an opportunity this year to really help us think about some of the really big challenges thrown up by the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic.
The App Challenge, it's an opportunity for us to learn from our young people and for the young folks to contribute to this very, very important conversation that we're having about getting us all going again.
QR check-ins are used to track the potential spread of COVID, but each region uses a different app to manage the QR check-in process, which is really confusing for travellers. Our app helps travellers keep track of all of these other apps so that they can be safe and informed while travelling.
With the right tools, the region's small business owners, they can build a stronger, digitally led recovery and a more inclusive economy for the future. Google is proud to be a partner in the digital transformation of Asia Pacific and thankful for the work that APEC is doing to support getting people moving again.
Since January 2020, the COVID-19 has been infecting 1.72 million people and killing over 18,000 people in Japan. Our economy has suffered and faced multiple challenges, such as educational disparity between low-income and high-income households, youth poverty, lack of access to mental health care, an increase in suicide rate, and women's job loss. For example, in September 2020, the government reported over 60,000 job losses due to the pandemic, especially in part-time jobs and the tourism sector, where women make up most of the workforce.
Although Japan has suffered from the pandemic, we battled through the toughest times thanks to our leaders' tremendous efforts. For example, our government announced a financial contribution of $1 billion at the COVAX AMC Summit to improve access to new and underused vaccines for children living in the world's poorest countries. They also launched a new digital agency to upgrade and overhaul the country's digital systems in order to tackle the issues from digital divide due to COVID. Also, Japan is the first country among G7 to invest FX reserves in ESG in hopes to help achieve a greener society and carbon neutrality in 2050.
In order to combat COVID-19 crisis, we have voices to our country and APEC leaders. First, international cooperation in the mental health sector for primarily young people and low-income populations is vital. More financial support to youth-led social initiatives and providing people-to-people exchange opportunities among APEC countries is also important. Promoting greener growth is also our concern. Steep emissions reductions in energy sectors and transforming our economy into a circular one is what we should work on from post-COVID-19 recovery. APEC economies should consider creating mutual standards in manufacturing products or services that fosters a circular economy in our region.
Whether on issues of healthcare, climate change, technology, or human rights, we as VOF delegates must continue to be the voices to advocate for societies. Despite many difficulties we all faced during the pandemic, it all taught us that we can tackle some of the most pressing intergenerational challenges by working together. Through collaboration and transparency between the APEC leaders and youth, we can reject pessimism and cynicism. So let's work together to promote economic growth and progress towards an inclusive future.
Thank you very much, Japan, for that submission. Now we move to the final session today, featuring the chair of the APEC Business Advisory Council, Rachel Talele. The APEC Business Advisory Council, known as ABAC, is the voice of business in APEC. ABAC comprises 3 advisors from each APEC economy who work together throughout the year to provide advice to APEC leaders. This year's report was handed over by Rachel to New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern at the end of last month. The chair of ABAC is held by a business person from the host economy of APEC. As you will see from the biographic notes we have circulated, Rachel Tlele is CEO of business design and brand strategy firm Oho and was previously CEO of Kono, a food and beverage company. Before that, she represented New Zealand's trade promotion organisation in the United States. Rachel will provide some remarks on ABAC's work and the view of business, and then we'll open up for comments and questions. Please welcome Rachel.
Ai ngā mana i ngā reo i ngā maunga whakahi tīnā koutou katoa. Tēnei te mihi mai o hei ki koutou katoa i tēnei rā. Ko Ngāti Raukawa ki te tonga, ko Ngāti Rārua, ko Ngāti Kōtau hoki ngā iwi, ko Ngāti Huia tōku hapu, ko Rachel Taulelei tōku ingoa. So greetings to everyone who's online this afternoon. I'm really honoured to be able to join you for your hui or for your meeting at the tail end of it. So we'll make sure that it's, I hope, a lively end to what I'm sure has been an amazing meeting. And look, I initially said, jumped at the chance to speak at your meeting today because I thought they were asking me as a voice for the future, but turns out you're the voices of the future. And I subsequently, the more I have learned about you, have become really just in awe of you and your impact on your communities and your interest in this area. So kia ora tātou. So it is my pleasure to have a chat to you about ABAC, and I won't assume that anyone knows necessarily all of the ins and outs of ABAC and where we are and what we do. So we'll cover some of those fundamentals there. And I guess as a precursor comment, APEC Voices of the Future is an incredible opportunity for you as young leaders to connect with APEC and ABAC, which is of course the leading forum for discussing economic and business interests in the Asia Pacific. So as you may be aware, ABAC is the business voice of APEC. It brings together 3 senior business representatives from each of APEC's economies to advise leaders, ministers, and senior officials. I think it can be said really that collectively this year we have met the challenge of a virtual hosting, and as you will know, that was forced upon us through the pandemic. I know that our government colleagues like to say that there have been enough virtual meetings this year for us all to have been able to watch the Lord of the Rings trilogy 85 times. So that is not a small number of hours spent online. And we too in ABAC have risen to the challenge one Zoom at a time with over 80 online meetings. These meetings have enabled us to produce a report to leaders with 43 recommendations and 5 detailed annexes over the 5 pillars of our work. A few weeks ago, ABAC released this report to leaders, and it's really what I would say a blueprint for what we think as business needs to get done in the region for it to get moving again, even as we slowly emerge from the pandemic. The theme that we chose as hosts this year for ABAC was People, Place and Prosperity, or Tangata, Taiao me te Tauri Kura. And particularly, we felt this was important at this time of crisis, that we put people at the centre of all of our decisions. Our report focuses on 5 key areas: regional economic integration, or trade and investment by another name, sustainability, inclusion, which is around reaching out to disadvantaged and underrepresented groups and making the benefits of trade to all, digital, and the economy. As the chair of ABAC this year, I'm really proud of the whole report, but particularly so of the things that we really championed. And those include a strong statement of support for the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which underpins the security of global trade. A set of climate leadership principles for business, which are entirely relevant as we focus on COP26 and what's needed to save the planet. A statement of priorities for Indigenous business, which was released on behalf of over 90 Indigenous business leaders from 8 economies who we brought together in July. And some robust recommendations about how to advance the digital economy and scale up smaller businesses in particular. Our report also sets out some ideas for the safe and seamless reopening of borders when circumstances permit, and our thoughts on the implementation of APEC's Putrajaya Vision to 2040. I see that all of these issues are relevant for your discussions on COVID, which has to be our top priority. And they include digital, climate, and inclusion. Our work this year, as I referenced, was made more complicated by the need to move into a virtual gathering, but it didn't prevent us from continuing to engage with our colleagues and developing recommendations for leaders. Later in this week, in a couple of nights' time, the ABAC members will have the opportunity to discuss these matters and the report directly with the leaders themselves. So those are the economic leaders from around the region. This is really a high point of ABAC's year, and this year the dialogue is even more important because of we haven't been able to hold the dialogue for the last 2 years as a result of COVID. During our session with the leaders, with the country leaders, we'll have a short plenary session where I, along with the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Prime Minister Ardern, will speak briefly, and then we have 5 groups established, each of which has 4 leaders and about 10 members in each one, and we'll explore 2 topics that are in our report. The first is how we emerge from the health crisis and begin the process of rebuilding the region's trade and economy. The second is what tools we can use to address today's challenges of inclusion and sustainability. So within the parameters of a virtual format, we're looking forward to a robust discussion, which I really hope will contribute to the leaders' own discussion the following day. As you will find through today and tomorrow, it's a hard one to manage in a virtual environment, but it's one that the Prime Minister in particular is very invested in having a robust interactive discussion. The pandemic has raised the stakes of international cooperation and engagement. There's simply no way to find the solutions to the problems today except by working together. APEC is often referred to somewhat dismissively, I would say, as a perfect excuse for a conversation, which is to say there is a lot of talking. But as I look back at the work we have done this year, I think this could be recast in the spirit of the Putrajaya vision as a powerful example of community. It's that spirit of community, of shared challenge and shared endeavour that's been able to get us through these challenging times. At the heart of this community lie dialogue and discussion, and it is precisely this habit of meeting as we are now and talking regularly that helps form the bonds of community that we see so clearly in APEC. Māori, we as Māori, have many sayings, whakatauki we call them, and one of them reads, he aha te kaya te rangatira, he kōrero, he kōrero, he kōrero. What is the food of a leader? It is discussion, dialogue, and communication. And so it has been an honour to speak with you today briefly, and I know we'll have questions, and it has been a real privilege for me to be able to lead ABAC in 2021. I look forward to hearing the fruit of your discussions, of your kōrero. Within our whānau and within Māoridom, we often talk about making moko-driven decisions, and moko is short for mokopuna, which is about your grandchild or your grandchildren or your children. So making moko-driven decisions is about making decisions now that ensure for a prosperous future for our grandchildren's grandchildren and beyond. And it feels a lot like today's discussion that you're having and the one that you'll have tomorrow is just that. It's about making good decisions now, about making the right decisions now to lay up a prosperous future for those who will follow behind us with the wellness of that future generation in mind. So on that note, I'm very, very happy to answer any questions you might have, how I was introduced to ABAC, what my experience has been, any of the questions that might be on your mind about the APEC Business Advisory Council. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you very much, Rachel. And look, I'm sure the delegates watching today wouldn't mind me saying that they'd be happy to have you as an honorary member of Voices of the Future.
Well, I was waiting for that actually. That was, you know, we were going to get back there.
Yeah. We do have plenty of questions. Just to let everybody know, we're going to go first to Hong Kong, China, then to Korea, Indonesia, Peru, and then Philippines. So Hong Kong, China, if you're ready with your question, over to you first.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Rachel, for the wonderful remarks you made, Jacinta. I just want to ask one very straightforward question, which is to say that it strikes me that there's an elephant in the room right now when it comes to business cooperation that can't be avoided. As much as we would want to focus ideally on talking about economic interests and the alignment in face of digital challenges, sustainability-related issues, there is also the question of politics and politicization of economic issues, whether it be in the form of protectionist discourses, populist narratives against integrated trade, or indeed, I suppose, well-founded disillusionment and disgruntlement concerning the allocation of dividends and also profits within the region amongst member economies. In face of these challenges, i.e. the politics pulling at and tugging at the economics, what exactly could the business advisory community and also the APEC community at large collectively do in order to uphold joint and collective economic interests of not just its countries, businesses, but also the peoples of the respective states? Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. Great question. And it's one that we've actually encountered this year. My overarching comment would be that APEC is the business voice. So we, by design, are held largely at arm's length from APEC. And that is, I think that is really, there's a number of reasons why that would be, but one of them isn't around the ability for us to provide free and frank advice to APEC and not feel bound by necessarily the political and geopolitical restraints or limitations that they might find themselves within. We also are a consensus, an organisation formed on consensus and collegiality, but we are in the business of advice, and we are in the business of advice founded in business sensibilities. So oftentimes what you will find is that we will reach a collective agreement around a desired outcome. It might be climate change as an example. These things won't find themselves in the report or in any of the annexes unless they have been agreed upon. So the outcome is agreed on. How that shows itself in the various economies and how that manifests itself in the action of the economies is up to the economies themselves. We don't get involved in the implementation of that advice. That is the purview of the economy. But we do invariably find ourselves as a business, perhaps due to hardwiring, pushing a little harder and a little faster than our APEC colleagues perhaps are allowed to do within their own bounds. So that's a luxury, that's a privilege to be able to move in that way as the business voice. It doesn't overlook, as you say, the geopolitical issues that confront us, but we do it with a view to mobilising business first.
That's a great response. Thank you very much, Rachel and Hong Kong China, for that question. Now, we may have lost Korea, but can I see if Korea's there with their question? Possibly not. So in that case, we'll go to Indonesia. You're next with your question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can.
Okay, sure. Yeah, thank you so much for the great presentation. I have a question regarding how Asia Pacific is very diverse region, right? And how actually the context of each economy is basically very different one another. And it's actually a kind of like a follow-up question on your answer, which is how you said that APEC actually works based on mobilizing business first. How do you think that it's actually effective to ensure that it actually closing the gap between each of these economies in regard to inequality between these economies within Asia Pacific, because it's very diverse?
Sure, great question. I think you're right. I mean, we are all very different. There is no universality, despite the fact that we're all business and we're all part of the APEC region. There is no universality to us as a people. But I would say that as well from within the economy. So if I look at within New Zealand and within Māoridom, oftentimes you can mistake or make the mistake of assuming that people are all of the same, but there's simply not. There are as many differences amongst Māori as there are commonalities, as you will find in your own economies amongst your own populations. And that is exacerbated when you take it into a region-wide space. So we really work double time to try and find the common points of interest. And as I said at the outset, this year in particular, on the back of last year's introduction of COVID, or at least it's showing itself, people were that common touch point. How do we keep people safe and well and fed, essentially? Food sovereignty is a huge issue in and around the APEC region. How do you care for people in a way that keeps them safe? And so putting that at the center of all of our decision making, I think brought us together in a way that we might not have come together otherwise. I don't know. I'm I don't have a looking glass. I'm not a futurist. I couldn't tell, but I know from experience that COVID created situations that we probably in and of ourselves couldn't have created independently. So they forced us to look to the common touch points between us as people. The sad effect of COVID is that it exacerbated what existed already. So inequity and inequality and poverty and lack of access and underrepresentation all existed before COVID. COVID simply accelerated and exacerbated that situation. Now, being aware of that situation and acknowledging its existence is the first part of resolving that. And what I've seen through ABAC this year is economies coming together, taking responsibility for the idea that that has occurred, and then working very closely to share ideas on what is working in their economy. And that was one of the reasons that we led very strongly on the idea of inclusion this year. So we did, for instance, put together a dashboard around social equity that we are still working on because it's only a short year. But that was led by Julia Torreblanca out of Peru around putting together a social equity dashboard that could work across the region. So you can start to get a baseline for where people sit in their economies and economies against each other. And likewise with the Indigenous economies, 270 million Indigenous people in this region have never featured on the APEC agenda. So it was very dear to my heart this year to put that on our agenda so you can start bringing that to the table consistently and having that be recognised as an important part of all of our economic development and all of our economies. So I think it takes somebody to really grab a hold of these issues and bring them to the group and present them in a way that engenders people's support, recognition, and then support for ensuring that this doesn't, in as much as is possible, is managed.
Thank you, Indonesia and Rachel, for that. Now, could we cross to Peru for your question? Do we have Peru? We may not have Peru, but let's try Philippines. Philippines, are you there?
Hello everyone, mabuhay and Aotearoa to our speaker this afternoon. So on behalf of the Philippines, we would like to ask, with COP26 happening right now in Glasgow, Scotland, and with governments being urged to do necessary measures to protect our planet, what are the necessary measures or policies being done by APEC Business Advisory Council to encourage the member economies and their respective businesses to be more environmentally responsible for our planet and contribute to the commitments and promises both in COP26 and other conferences as well? And follow-up question, are there also APEC-wide agreements and policies to encourage economies and businesses to be more environmentally effective and responsible? Thank you.
Yeah, no, very, very, very incredibly relevant, as you say, because of COP26, but equally because, to my mind and to our mind within ABAC, COVID was a curtain raiser for climate change challenges. So whilst it was and is presently remains devastating to us as a people, so too is and will be climate change if we don't address that with urgency. So we did arrive, in a number of recommendations that you'll find in our report and that annexes to the report. One of them that we're particularly proud of was in and around the principles for leadership as it pertains to climate change, and they were based on some work that was done here in New Zealand, and we have pitched those into the report and pitched those into the leaders to say, from a business standpoint, these are the principles of leadership that we would hope to see across the region if we're really to address climate change. We focus in and around just transitions. We had conversations about renewable energies, and look, whilst mitigation of emissions is important, adaptation of immediate impacts and ensuring a just transition to that low carbon future is equally important as focus goes. Climate change is scaled at 50 times more impactful on those sectors of our society, than COVID was. And so that's extreme, to my point of it being a curtain raiser, 50 times more impactful. So what we need to do, and what we have conversed around, is the need to ensure that the lessons of COVID are applied to a just transition to a low carbon future. And again, this isn't something that didn't pre-exist COVID. It was there before. It has simply come to the future now. So we do have the advice, we do have the principles of leadership. They are sitting with both the leaders and the businesses as well. There's a responsibility on the business leaders to take them back to their own industries and their own communities and try to put those in place. But these things do happen at a different rate depending on which economy you do find yourself in.
Thank you, Rachel. We have time for a couple more questions. I might ask you one actually. You've been chair of ABAC over this year, which has been obviously hugely impacted by the pandemic, and until recently you were CEO of a food exporter. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the challenges and opportunities that exist in particular in that food and beverage sector in the wake of the pandemic?
Sure. And I should say it's a really interesting environment to come into within APEC and ABAC, because when I came in and I was appointed at the end of 2019, this was my very first introduction to this forum. And whilst I appreciated the ability to move around the world in a rules-based trading environment as an export company, I really don't think I'd turn my mind to the mechanisms that sat in behind that. Who might influence that, or who might stymie that, who might enable me to do so. So being a part of these conversations has been fascinating, an exercise, I would say, in patience, because unlike business, this conversation moves at a different pace, and it moves, you have 21 economies, you have 63 members, you have an infinite number of positions on these topics. And so it is an exercise in consensus. And so I've really appreciated the ability to both witness and lead those forums. So, and as a business who does export, and I did lead Kono, a Māori food and beverage company, for 6 years, the challenges come thick and fast on the best of days, let alone days that are cursed by COVID. So, you know, one of those is in and around supply chain, your ability to move your products around the world. And that includes not only just your product, but also people. And the way we saw that show itself immediately in our conversations with ABAC is, how do you move people who are involved in the medical industry and also vaccines and all of the supplies like PPE around the world very quickly when all of a sudden things come to a grinding halt. So as a food and beverage exporter or an exporter per se, you almost need to take a bit of a back seat while we get the most urgent products and people moving around the world to address people's safety and wellness. So supply chain is still recovering. Climate change is absolutely a challenge in that space. Food security is an issue. So I think that before, COVID has probably brought about behaviour, almost understandably a little protectionist in nature, where people found and felt the need to ensure that their own community was safe. But I would hope that those behaviours don't persist, that we do reopen and start moving product around the world that we did in a way that we did before COVID. So avoiding those protectionist behaviours, because they tend to impede our ability to get back to that very dynamic region that we have been. So trade is a real tool in our ability to recover from COVID and get back to being that dynamic region that we've always been. So yeah, supply chain, moving of products, climate change, labour is a challenge for a lot of industries, and to that point, I think this digital for me has shown itself as one of the great, if not the greatest enabler to our ability to really unlock business and seamless resumption of business, but certainly a tool for our MISMEs, our micro, small to medium-sized enterprises, our women who are in business, and our Indigenous economies. So I'm very interested and invested in where our working group conversations take us as it pertains to digital in the future.
Thanks for that great response. You've touched on a lot of the points that we have talked about today, so it was great to hear. I've been told that Peru is back now with their questions, so could we go please to Peru?
Hi, yes, this is Gloria from the Economy of Peru. Our question will be, in this particular context, a small and medium business can balance between scaling up and sustainable growth.
So if I just recapture your question, so how does a small to medium-sized business balance the scale up with sustainability, was it?
Sorry.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. Sorry, I think a bad connection.
Do you want to try your? Can you ask your question one more time for us, please?
Yes. In this particular context, how do you think a small and medium business can balance between scaling up and be sustainable?
Great.
Look, I think that's around how intentional and how purposeful you wish to be with your business. So in the business that I was a part of, we had an intergenerational strategy. We had a plan that looked forward 500 years, and we called it Te Pai Tawhiti, which means the distant horizon. And what that plan told us was that it was our responsibility, as I referenced earlier, to make the sorts of decisions now that protected and enhanced our treasures, our taonga, whether that's our place or our people, for the benefit of future generations. So if that is your driver, then you automatically have a sustainable mindset, a sustainable view of the world. So you can scale up. You just have to do it with a consciousness that the decisions you make are not about your own short-term gain. They have to be made in the context of you as a global citizen, really, and in the context of you ensuring that you don't do damage to people and you don't do damage to place in the process of your ambitions to scale up. So I think anything is possible. I think that our MISMEs are the most exciting businesses amongst us because they're oftentimes the most innovative and the most exciting, and they're the ones that are solving problems that show themselves to us. And they have the ability to really sprint hard and solve those problems. But that, for me, really the only benefit of them doing that is if they do that with a sustainable mindset, one that has care for people in place.
That was a great question. Rachel, I'd love to just ask a final question to you. We're approaching the end of New Zealand's host year of APEC, and I just wondered if you could reflect back over the last year and perhaps tell us what your personal highlight in your role as chair of ABAC has been.
Yeah, of course. Well, this was my personal highlight, is that to the Indigenous conversation again, my ability, and it wasn't mine, because there is another saying that, within Māori, that your success is never yours alone. It is always that of the collective. And I'm extremely proud of our ability to bring forward a conversation around Indigenous economies when a number of economies are uneasy in having that conversation. And I think that to at least bring it to the table and to have created a statement of priorities for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous businesses can't be underestimated, because if that is the smallest, almost, most insignificant part of our economies and it made it to the table, it really gives me great hope for what we might be able to do in these forums, so long as we remained, without being too naive about this, remain really true of heart and committed to the conversations that we prioritize or that we value, because you'll never prioritize anything that you don't value. So given the degree to which I value conversations around Indigenous economies and the place of Indigenous peoples.
Looks like just at the end there we've lost Rachel. It's the joys of digital technologies, right? Rachel, thank you so much for your time with us today. I've really enjoyed hearing from you. That actually brings us to the end of today's session. Thank you very much to all of our speakers and our delegates for what's been a very fascinating program. Before we end, I'd just like to remind you that tomorrow we have further keynote remarks from the UN Secretary General's Envoy for Youth and Wayne Hay, a journalist with a deep knowledge of the Asia-Pacific region. We'll have two further sessions tomorrow, a greener future and a future for all, before we come to the highlight of the event, the handover of the Youth Declaration to New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and an interactive discussion with her. Also, a reminder that the interviews that delegates have recorded for this event are available through our website, apec2021nz.org. There's a great range of material there which provides some interesting perspectives on the issues facing our region. So thank you all very much for being part of today, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Goodbye, mā te wā.
Tangi mo te tenei taku mana wa e